Okay, I'm going to get started and I'll keep an eye on the waiting room in case anyone else trickles in. So once again, my name's Miriam. I'm the coordinator of the series Cross-Pollinations. If you are new to our series, welcome. And if you've been joining us before, welcome back and thanks for following along. The series has been running for a couple of years now on the last Wednesday of every month at the same time, always on Zoom, and different themes. So today's theme is on disability and specifically amputation and amputee. And I'm really excited to have Therese and Shaelyn with us. I will get into a brief bio and introduction about them, but I first want to acknowledge that we're all coming from different places in the world, clearly from as far as New Delhi and the States and all across Canada. I'm personally based here in Toronto, which is covered under Treaty Number 13 in the Williams Treaty. It's traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Chippewa, as well as now home to a really diverse urban Indigenous population of First Native, Métis, and Inuit people. So in terms of Therese and Shaelyn is working now as of a month at Western's Medical Museum and Archives. And I actually came across Shaelyn's work because she wrote a really amazing master's thesis on how disability and amputation in particular are archived and documented in Canadian museums, which is super related to the poet we have joining us today, Therese. And Therese wrote this just incredible book of poetry called Phantompains about her lived experience of amputation and illness and disability more generally. She is also training as a psychotherapist while working as a teacher right now. So I'm really excited to see how these two perspectives come together. And at the end, we'll have a chance for Q&A discussion. I'm going to stop sharing and you two can get started in whichever way you choose.
I think Therese and I had discussed that I'll be starting. So we'll jump right in. I'm going to share my screen because I have a bit of a presentation to share with you all. Here we go. Can everyone see? One second here. Can everyone see the slides? Good. Okay. Excellent. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I hope you enjoy our presentation. Therese and I have been so eager to share our work with all of you. In this talk, we're going to go back and forth a little bit and explore the past and the present of the experiences of disabled people, and specifically amputees, their embodied experiences, how we understand them, and what they mean. The past part of this talk is where I come in. I spent the last 2 years putting together research for my master's thesis in the history on amputation and disability in Canadian archives and museums. My thesis, Missing Parts, a critical analysis of amputees and disability history in 3 Canadian museums and archives, was formed of a series of case studies of museums and archives in Canada. I'll be touching on 2 of these today, as well as on some of the theoretical underpinnings of my work in disability history. So a big theme in our presentation today as a whole is spaces where things meet, the sort of dialectic spaces between things that are seemingly opposed or intersections. I'm going to talk a bit here today about these spaces in disability history as Therese relates her own experiences in her world today. But first, we're going to take a step back and I'm going to introduce you to the basis of my research, which sits at the intersection between critical disability studies and archival theory. I build on the work of scholars like Sarah White, Jeffrey Riome, and Brayson Brillmeyer, whose work brings together archival practice and disability studies. Therese's essay, which you'll hear in a bit, introduces us to the meeting of the individual and the other in her own experience of disability, while my work focuses on the physical spaces where disability meets history. Of course, I'm talking about museums and archives. Those familiar with the study of history know that the types of sources historians most often use in their research are varied. And it's said by many in the field that historians tend to have a bit of a bias for written textual sources, most often found in archives. It's my belief that in disability history, as in any history regarding a group of people whose voices have historically been left out of the official record, museums and the material culture, that is the objects that they preserve, are vital spaces for tangible research about the embodied experiences of disabled people in the past. And as well, we can have a bit more of a conceptual analysis of how we understand the past experiences of disabled people and how this can be shaped by the way they're presented in museums and other memory institutions. I distinguish as well, as we'll see later, between different types and sizes of museums and archives and the different things about disability we can learn from each of them. So to start off, when I talk about the embodied experiences of disabled people in the past, I'm referring to a concept in critical disability studies called complex embodiment, first theorized by disability scholar Tobin Siebers in 2008, and brought into archival and museum studies by Sarah White in 2012. Complex embodiment is a way of seeing disability which moves beyond the binary medical and social models that you can see in the presentation here. The medical model sees disability as the product of a person's individual body. Disability is a medical issue, it's the product of a disease, it's something which produces impairments in a person's body. The social model, which has been recently the prevailing model, sees disability as a form of oppression, which is caused by society's construction of so-called normal bodies. A world constructed for able-bodied people disadvantages those who don't conform to its idea of what is normal. Like the idea of potential space, which Therese is going to refer to later, complex embodiment takes these two models and focuses on the intersection between them, the meeting of the medical or the body and the social or the world. It recognizes disability as a multifaceted experience, the interplay between a person's disabled body and the world around them, which shapes their complex individual experience. Museums are places that historians can most tangibly explore these complex embodied experiences because we can begin to examine, as Therese has done with her own experience, the relationships between people and technologies of enablement like prosthetics. And I'll pass it over to Therese for the first part of her presentation.
Thanks, Shaelyn. Thanks everyone for being here. And thank you, Miriam, for putting this on as well, and for the League of Canadian Poets. So I'm going to read an essay that I've written for my second book, which will be forthcoming with Book Hug, hopefully 2025 or 2026. And I use Winnicott's theory of potential space to kind of like help me process how I feel about my prosthetic legs. When I wear my prosthetic legs, I disappear to remain. My eyes open. I sit up and swing my legs to the side of my bed. I put on my silicone liners to protect my skin. Then I put on a sock or two if I need them. The socks are made out of cotton and shaped like thumbless mittens, the same shape as my silicone liners. They ensure an exact fit, meaning they prevent my knee and limbs from banging my socket. Finally, I place my residual limbs in my sockets, pull up my sleeves that keep me suctioned in and stable and dry in the way a scuba suit prevents water from touching skin. The sleeves are lined with silicone as well and has a thin layer of cloth surrounding it. They make sure my prosthesis don't fly off while I'm walking. I push myself up off my bed, mainly with my arms and abdominals, and stand. I balance precariously in the air and lean on my bedroom wall for support. I sink in further with the weight of my whole body and walk in place a couple steps. I readjust my sleeves and pull them up snugly. I am encased in the stiffness that is my prosthesis. Body into machine, machine containing body. My brain holds the truth that my limbs are not my prosthesis, never forgetting that my human legs continue to exist. A hybrid of antithetical somatic experiences. One, vulnerable, the other, unbending. My flesh, soft and warm, temperamental and easy to bruise. My prosthesis, solid, built to withstand destruction, devoid of any sentiment. My flesh moves and flows with and into my animatronic parts, a daily conversation between my nerve endings and gizmo. I walk out into the world with a version of me who is bound to a robot. A while ago, I came across Paralympian Haven Shepherd's, a fellow bilateral below knee amputee's Instagram account. Haven became an amputee after her parents detonated a bomb, intending to commit a family suicide. She survived and was later adopted by an American family. In one of her Instagram posts, she speaks about wiping her prosthetic legs clean to get them ready. I've never thought of wiping the dirt and soil off of my prosthetic legs. They are just objects to me. When I take them off every night before bed, I lean them next to my night table where they sit, still and dirty, and I instantly forget about them. My prosthetic legs only come into somatic consciousness when my nerve sense pain. Skin blisters, muscle suffocation, my shin and blood vessels bruising slowly from the constant banging of my bone against carbon fiber. The most worrisome sort is when I start to feel my knee clicking. It's cartilage moving side to side against my ligament like a tempered rug burn. I wish I could just put on my prosthetic legs and walk in silence, both animatronic and corporeal parts muted in full integration. Instead, I move through spaces encumbered by dead weight. Without my prosthetics, I am not ambulatory. Without them, there is a dynamic version of me I cannot access. There have been moments when I absolutely hated my prosthesis, moments when I wish I could destroy them. But even during these moments, I cannot deny their existence. Potential space. A space, according to Winnicott, where the me and not me meet. A dialectical third space where one's inner experiences encounter something outside of oneself, and is through encountering what is outside of ourselves do we begin to deepen our sense of self. Potential space. A space where two people, at first other to one another, meet to create something meaningful together. Potential space. A dynamic space of understanding. My prosthetic legs, like most mobility devices, act as a portal for movement into terrestrial and public realms. She shapes my subjective experience of my external phenomena and informs my relational experience. My prosthetic legs expand my sentience. Therefore, I cannot escape her. She is my potential space, a third space where two entities, my body and my prosthesis, can meet to find belonging in each other. A space where my lifeless apparatus can join my body to dream together if we choose to do so. I'm gonna give this, I'm gonna, I guess, send the mic over to Shaelyn.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my presentation again here. So as Therese was so beautifully saying in her essay, the relationship between a disabled person and their prosthesis is a very personal one. Today, it's important to listen to the voices of disabled people in order to learn about their experiences. But what can we do when it comes to the experiences of disability of people long since past? We want to adhere to the model of complex embodiment and recognize that in the past as now, their experiences were multifaceted and unique. Oftentimes, the experiences of disabled people were not written down or they weren't preserved. This is where museums and material culture come in. Material culture is the aspects of any given culture which are embodied in the physical objects created by people. So the material culture of disability could include things like prosthetic limbs, with other examples being medications taken by disabled people, mobility aids like walkers and wheelchairs, hearing aids, and other objects used by people with disabilities in their daily lives. This kind of material culture is often found in museums. So disability history as a subject of study has long been subsumed under the history of medicine. So my research in this area took me to the Museum of Healthcare at Kingston, Ontario. The museum's mandate is to tell the story of Canadian health and medicine, which shows how people have preserved health and managed disease, pain, and suffering. I worked as a collections technician at this museum for 5 years, and during my time there, I worked a great deal with a particular set of 2 prosthetic legs, which can reveal a great deal about the complex experience of the person who wore them. The legs were accessioned into the museum in 2012 and belong to a farmer from Lynn, Ontario, which is near Brockville, named Ernest Hanna. Oftentimes, prosthetics come into museum with little or no information attached to them about the person who owned them, but these records attached to these legs are some of the most complete disability-related records in the Museum of Healthcare's collections. Ernest Hanna, who's circled here as a child, was born in 1896. He was a farmer, as was his father before him and his son Raymond after him. In 1920, he married Pearl Green, and they had 2 children who survived into adulthood. Around the year 1931, when he was about 35 years old, he lost his left leg above the knee in an accident. There are multiple accounts of the accident, but they all agree that Hanna was driving a horse and wagon when his horse bolted and caused Hanna's leg to be broken. He allegedly sustained a compound fracture of his femur, an injury which entails part of the broken bone coming through the skin. Unfortunately for Ernest Hanna, his limb became infected. Gangrene set in and his leg had to be amputated. He gained 2 prosthetic legs and continued to work on his farm until his death in 1969. Disability scholars Julie Anderson and Lisa O'Sullivan, in their book chapter entitled Histories of Disability in Medicine, Reconciling Historical Narratives and Contemporary Values, point out that medical technologies like prosthetics might feel alienating or dehumanizing, but they can also be life-saving objects with which people create a mediated relationship. These relationships are very intimate and enduring for many people. Anderson and O'Sullivan point out the historical interests of prosthetics in museums lies in the meanings that their original users gave to them, which we can decipher from the physical clues on the object. Ernest Hanna had 2 separate prosthetic legs, which he apparently never replaced for the rest of his life. One was his working leg for his daily farm work, and the other his Sunday leg. You can see here the differences between the 2. The working leg is more robust, it's a bit more worn out, it's heavier. I've had to lift both of them. And crucially, it has several homemade repairs and reinforcements, like electrical tape on the pelvic belt, leather and metal reinforcements on the knee, and a nylon stocking covering the hip joint. These challenge narratives of medical intervention and patient passivity, as Hanna exercised control over his own prosthetic limbs. The Sunday leg is clean and well taken care of, and both legs are wearing a boot and a sock, which he has thumbtacked into the wood to keep it from falling down. The sock being kept up this way tells us so much about the mediated relationship Hanna has with his prosthesis. He tried in this way to make them less dehumanizing and more like himself. He lovingly cared for them and used them to present himself in particular ways, while making many modifications to them to increase his own physical and emotional comfort and his mobility. And I'll pass it back to Therese for the next part.
During the summer of 2022, I was reminded of the infinite potential that exists in the spaces of dreams by the artist Jenny Julia Wallinheimo-Heimonen. Wallinheimo-Heimonen has been creating confrontational art that unnerves ableist assumptions in Finland for decades. She is somewhat of a disabled magician. Despite her bio stating that she's a textile and conceptual artist, and you can check out her Instagram. I happened to walk into her art exhibit at the Harbourfront Center in June of 2022. She called it, "This is not a rehabilitation project." In the small gallery, plush, colorful, and glittery objects on tables and ceilings greet visitors. The whole gallery throbs with playful curiosity. It is an open invitation to engage with disability politics. And Wallinheimo-Heimonen's message, to disrupt the purity and power of the able-bodied gaze. In her exhibit, a winged walker on skis, which she uses to ski down a hill in one of her films, hangs from the ceiling. Across the walker, a version of the Virgin Mary, wearing a red dress with small embroidered roses and a sequin cape in the same color, sits in a wheelchair with dinner plates for wheels decorated with fruits like apples and berries. This sculpture, which was meant to be displayed in her hometown, garnered much ableist response from residents and local politicians who were upset that the Virgin Mary was depicted as a disabled person. According to them, she should only be shown as perfect and pure. Across from Mary, many televisions line the side walls attached with earphones for guests to use. They play the various short films she has made over the years. One film shares a video of a carousel she built and painted gold, with wheelchairs as seats and mannequin limbs jutting out from the center, along with modeled birds. The short clips show people wheeled around the merry-go-round happily by Jenny, while others try wheeling themselves with joy and glee and their friends and family around the carousel's limb centerpiece. Jenny tells me later that some people refused to sit on the wheelchair carousel since they thought it brought them bad luck and meant that they would soon be in a wheelchair. Across the film sits a large table set with various mini sculptures of cookies that she says are, quote, flavored with natural fear, end quote. On one cookie, you can read, weird people like you should be aborted before birth. On another, Smurf, troll, deform, mutant, midget. The table is a cornucopia of anti-ableist symbols, and the whole gallery is a political altar ready to challenge any ableist beliefs. In it, the corporeal experience of the spirit and creativity housed in a disabled body has become enshrined. It is a potential space made holy. I was lucky enough to spend some time chatting with Jenny that day when she invited me for tea behind the white curtain where she was working at. We sit in her workspace, which is separated by an opaque white curtain. We talk and connect about our specific disabilities and devices, her brittle bones, cane and hearing aids, my amputations and prosthesis. We discuss being infantilized, the lack of accessible residencies, social exclusion, being stared at for too long, the cost of maintaining our bodies and devices, the horrendous inaccessibility of the stairs, navigating through a crowd, our art practices, the loss of bodily agency, lack of funding, poverty, privilege, grief, trauma, friendships. Similar tracks my disabled friends and I cover. We meet each other in potential space, actually. Our conversation creates something new with all the parts of ourselves we have shared with one another in the form of personal experiences, ideas, and memories. Then all of a sudden, Jenny Julia brings up the topic of dreams. I feel silent inside. I exit our potential space. I confess to her that I've never really dreamt about the potentiality of my prosthesis. I never address my prosthesis unless I'm angry at her. She is an object and therefore not allowed to dream. Unlike Jenny Julia, who has placed wings on her walkers or transformed her crutches into a flute and played them, I've not dreamt beyond the obvious utility of my prosthetics, a device made generic in a clinic, despite it being molded for my body. In my mind, my prosthesis and I are irreconcilable. I have persisted in resisting her and want to call her other, despite us being tethered. I do not want to meet her in potential space. To do so would mean that I would have to lose absolute control of a personal reality I have somewhat curated. I would have to admit that I am dependent on her. I would have to lose a version of myself that is resolute, independent, infallible. I cannot accept frailty, even though I know it lives in me as well. I'll send it back to Shaelyn.
Thank you so much. The second type of museum that I researched for my thesis was the small local community museum with which many of us might be familiar. These are places, often mostly volunteer-run, which present exhibits on the history of their local community, and most often contain many archival records of the area. The museum I endeavored to study was the Middleville District Museum in tiny Middleville, Ontario, situated in the heart of Lanark County, up in the Ottawa Valley. As you can see from this snippet of a map, it's quite secluded. The Middleville Museum is unique in that every artifact they possess is constantly on display, and their archival records are stored openly. Nothing is hidden, and it's constructed in such a way as to give the community easy access to their tangible history. It is the unique structure of this museum and its archives that I focused on in my thesis, as it has the ability to construct disability in very particular ways, namely through the lens of community. Here, I focused on the story of John C. James. Born around 1877 in Lanark Village, James grew up around Middleville. On Monday, April 23rd, 1906, he was running a slash saw at Penman's Mill in Middleville. According to one source, had his fingers from the bottom of his pinky finger to his thumb severed when he reached out to help a fellow worker, Willie Wilson, to fix a faulty machine. The photo here is of the workers at Penman's Mill and includes both John C. James and Willie Wilson, but it's unclear who is who. John C. James had a prosthetic arm made for him in North Bay, Ontario, which had a claw on the end that would open and shut as he bent his elbow. The village took up a collection to help him out shortly after the accident, and John C. James soon found new work as a salesman for a nursery. He was married in 1910 to Adeline Peacock, and together they had 9 children and bought a farm together. When he passed away from a stroke in 1959, he was sent off by his community with a 7-paragraph obituary in the local newspaper. The physical spaces in which records and artifacts associated with John C. James are stored in museums, or in the museum, asks disability historians to think about disability in new ways. When looking for disability in a medical museum or in a larger archive, we often tend towards searching for disability as a theme, as an identity category, maybe trying to use a finding aid or something like that. Museums like Middleville ask us to think more deeply about the complexities of the lives of the disabled people in their communities. The records of John C. James are not arranged neatly together with other disability-related artifacts and records. Miss Middleville also possesses some rather unique wheelchairs, a pair of child's crutches, and some other documentation. But rather, John C. James was at home in many different places in the museum. His prosthetic arm was on display with an anecdotal story about a time his neighbor had to rescue him when the claw of his prosthetic got latched onto a runaway cow. The story of his accident was printed in a newspaper article memorializing the friend who he was helping when it happened. The cradle that he slept in as a baby was on display in a woodworking exhibit, and a photograph of his son cutting a field of oats was also in an exhibit on agriculture. The life of John C. James was not merely reduced to his disability, to the impairment, the medical side, or to the oppression that he might have faced in his life. His prosthetic arm was not the only thing he's known for. His life, including his disability, was complex. At Middleville, disability is something which does more than affect the life of the disabled person, either socially or medically. It's complexly embodied and has a lasting effect on the community and family around them, which is reflected in the archives. People like John C. James exercise agency in more ways than solely pushing back against their oppression, as one might find in a government or institutional archive. And local museums are an important place where historians can find evidence of disabled people's complex lives and agency beyond the frameworks of institutionalization, medicine, and activism, which are often talked about when we think about disability history. The way that museums like Middleville function and the way their archives and displays are arranged, which allow for this kind of interpretation of disabled people's lives as complex and deeply integrated, hinges on knowledge circulation. In a local museum, the production of the knowledge which gets displayed in exhibits and stored in the archives depends on the collaboration of the local community. People in Middleville would put together binders and scrapbooks on their family history or on the history of a particular place or business, and they would donate them to the museum. And the museum, in turn, would help community members to do research. Even in my research on John C. James, I was able to contribute to the archive as I found a newspaper article about his accident online, which I sent to the museum and was added to their collection. The practice of knowledge circulation this way between the museum and the community is important not only for the local people, but also for disability history and for disabled people who can contribute their embodied experiential knowledge to the museum's interpretation of disabled experiences of the past. In turn, the museum may present histories of disability which are equitable, informative, and demonstrate the complexity of people's experiences of disability. The intersection of disability history and archival and museum studies is growing, and with it, more and more archival work on disability is being done. Disability Archives Lab, which is based in Canada and directed by disability scholar Grayson Brillmeyer, hosts many different projects with the goal of, quote, centering the politics of disability, how disabled people are affected by archival representation, and how to imagine archival futures that are centered around disabled desires, as well as providing disabled people with opportunities to learn about and gain skills in archival processes and research, and building tools by and for disabled people to work with archives and make history accessible. My hope is that disability historians and disabled people will continue to work together to investigate the history of disability in unexpected places and new ways so we can write and create better disability histories. And I'll pass it back to Therese.
Self-acceptance of the whole self comes with a cost. To discard in one's mind what is now useless, an idea, a belief, a well-loved perception, to stop nourishing an archaic comfort. This is the archaic comfort I've been nursing since I got my prosthetic legs. I once had human legs and now I don't. Life was better, perfect, when I was able-bodied. Now I am disabled-bodied and can only survive with the help from others. It is difficult to be in my body, both bodies, my flesh body and my cyborg body. It is difficult to need so much. Before I became disabled, I was accepted. I could go in and out of most spaces with ease. No one stared at me, really, not like the way they do now. I was free of physical pain, and feelings of helplessness and frailty were far from me still. Youth was good, but if I had to admit, I was very lonely. It was hard for me to relate to others beyond an obligatory way. There was something hard, critical, and insecure inside of me. Perhaps something I inherited from a rejecting grandparent, an old archaic object. Like her, all I ever wanted was to be beautiful and fit in. These feelings stayed with me after I became disabled. I know that it is my internalized ableism and mean inner critic that stops me from befriending my prosthetic legs, and I am suspicious of change. In 2019, I was accepted into the training program at the Center for Training in Psychotherapy in Toronto, a space where I first encountered Winnicott and the multifaceted parts of myself. And in the 4 years I was in group therapy training, all the parts that hid all her longing to be loved under anger. Group therapy training was incredibly difficult. During my first 2 years, I hesitantly entered into potential space with my group mates or blocked people out with rage. I could not stand vulnerability. I could not stand being affected by others. Back then, being vulnerable meant pain. I could not stand to touch my own fragility. But as the years went on and as my peers and facilitator remained steady and resolute, I continued to explore entering in and out of potential space with them. I then began to feel less afraid of the other, the not me, the part of life that is fueled by imperfection and spontaneity, the part of myself that needs the other, the part of myself that wants to share something with the other. It was not easy, but slowly, with the help of others, my peers and teachers, I was able to touch the pieces of myself I had exiled because of shame and rejection. I could finally feel my vulnerability, and as a result, not reject it in myself or others. Although this is still a work in progress, it felt good to be in conversation. And one evening, shortly before my last moments in group therapy training, I found myself looking at my prosthetic legs, which I had taken off after work, and leaned on the couch beside me, and I was filled with a familiar feeling. I stand in front of a full-length mirror, naked, wearing my prosthesis. Warmth moves in my body and satiates all of my being. I see my vision, my body, my gizmo, my body in my gizmo in the mirror fading. There is buoyancy now. I do not resist.
Thank you so much. Just like a virtual round of applause for both of you. I didn't cut you off, right? That was okay, the natural wrap up. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that together. And I loved how you wove your two pieces back and forth. Shaelyn, that was super interesting to get this like deep dive into museums in Canada that I didn't even know existed, to be honest. But also to have this kind of wider perspective on disability studies and how it relates to museums and archives, and then to bring in the personal with Therese, you sharing. I feel so special that we got an early preview of your upcoming book. I cannot wait to read the full thing. So thank you so much to both of you. I usually like to give people about like 30 seconds or so to collect their thoughts, and then we can take questions by either raising your virtual hand or you're welcome to write them in the chat. So I'll give people about a minute to collect themselves.